Hey everybody, this is JDGaming back today with another episode of Get Better at Yu-Gi-Oh! So before the 2-week hiatus I had, we discussed for a few weeks how to deal with your opponent's threats that they throw at you, basically how to make the most out of your defensive options and then how to get through those defensive options as well. But one thing we haven't discussed yet is what exactly makes a card a threat. So to kind of go full circle this week, I'll be going over different examples of the types of things you would see as a threat to your strategy, how you can use those threats to pressure your opponent, and then next week we'll follow up, wrap things all up by going through the concept of threat escalation and how to make the best use out of them. So down in the description, as usual, you will see an article that has pretty much inspired this type of topic, and then I'll have some other miscellaneous readings that are either related to this or just interesting things that I think you guys might find interesting. And if down below you want to let me know any suggestions for future episodes of this series, then feel free to let me know as well. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. The first thing I want to discuss in this episode is a short list of the types of threats that you may consider using in your strategy and the types of impact they can have when facing your opponent's strategy. This is not, of course, an all-inclusive list by any means, but hopefully it gives you an example so you can start thinking about this concept for yourself. Anytime you have a big monster like the classic Blue Eyes White Dragon, your opponent's going to have some trouble getting over it. By having an attack score or defense score that's much higher than what the rest of the metagame likes to use, you're able to have your monster stick around longer, get over more monsters in battle, and deal bigger chunks of damage if your opponent is left defenseless. So, what exactly is Blue Eyes in terms of a threat? Well, it falls into what I think is the general definition of a threat, where if your opponent doesn't deal with whatever threat you field by committing their own cards or making some sort of play, they're going to lose. And that's the whole idea. You want to pressure your opponent with your monsters enough that they have to react. You want them to burn their cards. And if they don't have any defenses, then you should be able to use your threats to pressure enough to win the game as soon as possible. A card in a similar vein would be Blackluster Soldier. You have the same attack stat, but now you have 2 deadly abilities that lets it get rid of annoying monsters that would be difficult to otherwise, or you can even just attack twice and potentially wipe out a huge chunk of your opponent's life points, which makes it, in many ways, a much more devastating force. Of course, nowadays we can't discount Blue Eyes with all the support that it's gotten, but the basic idea is a big monster your opponent can't just fight over themselves forces them to play cards like Raigeki to get over it. Another type of card that would be very much a threat to your opponent is a card that nets them advantage every single turn. All 3 of these guys are able to mill free cards, and that usually means free resources for that strategy. And since they're able to make use out of those resources, if you don't deal with them soon enough, they will get so many cards, so much advantage that they will be able to snowball their way to a win, and you won't have any way of retaliating with your inferior resource base. So, you want to get rid of these. Unfortunately, a lot of these guys pack defenses beyond that. Dante has this kind of landmine replace itself ability where if you touch it, then it's going to be annoying for you, so you have to find some way to not trigger that destruction, or sending to the graveyard rather, ability. Lightsworns all have the defensive power of Honest to protect them, and even Michael the Lightsworn has this bonus ability of replacing all of your lost Lightsworns and gaining you some life when it leaves the board. So these monumental threats are actually a lot harder to deal with than they appear at first glance. And that's another category of types of cards. Cards that are just hard to get rid of, either because you don't want to, like these, or the Fire and Ice hands, where if you destroy them, they'll start taking apart chunks of your game plan, or cards that are just outright defensive, things like Stardust Dragon and Cyframe Lord Omega. Now, Stardust Dragon, of course, has been played for a very long time to combat strategies that rely on simple removal tricks, either through on-theme monster effects or spell and trap cards like Raigeki or MST, and it helps secure your position. Things like Cyframe Lord Omega are even more annoying because this has the ability to just dodge everything you throw at it, and your opponent somehow has to deal with this 28 body that's extremely difficult to get off of the board. Even if the rest of your board isn't safe with Omega, if you don't kill them in the time that they've left themselves a little less defended, you're going to have a tough time dealing with this big body that's able to swing at you and potentially end the game during your opponent's turn. Another type of an annoying card would be a stun card that has the ability to limit your plays. These three are notorious for being able to lock you out of a huge chunk of your cards and potentially even prevent your strategy from going off. While they do have a bit of a time-sensitive nature that I'll discuss in a moment, they do have real power whenever they are matched up with the type of deck that they are able to stop. And for that reason, being able to just totally shut out decks, they are a big threat, because if you can't deal with them immediately, much like these defensive cards, your opponent is going to have so much free reign over the control, over the pace of the game, that you're going to fall behind. And then the last thing I have here as an example would be cards like Black Rose Dragon or Trishula. Pretty much any monster that has this big effect as soon as it hits the board is a threat, because if you can't stop it with an effect failure or well-timed breakthrough skill right when it hits play, you're missing out, and your opponent will have done all the damage they need to with their monster before you have a turn to retaliate on the following turn. And that's assuming that their Trishula or Black Rose doesn't leave you wide open for a game-ending push right then and there. I don't have an example on hand right now, but if you think of a card like Wave Motion Cannon, the continuous spell that says during each of your standby phases, place a counter on it, and then you can remove this card with all these counters on it to burn your opponent for 1,000 for each. A thing like that can be a threat too, because if your opponent doesn't deal with it with back row removal as soon as possible, that can do a game-ending amount of damage. So you can see now there are many different ways you can approach this concept of a threat, but again, it boils down to the definition of anything that you present to your opponent that if they don't deal with it immediately, they will lose the game. The next concept I want to discuss real briefly is the sensitivity of these cards and basically the specific roles that they play. The reason it becomes so important to understand how each of these cards function is to decide whether or not it's worth running them. Take, for example, when Thunder King was at 3, this thing was played in everything from Plant Synchro to the first few Xyz decks of the formats way back in 2011. And it was an astounding card. But when it got hit down to 1, it started being very subpar, even with cards like Mistake being near staple against Necros. Why is that? Well, it really has to do with how Thunder King works. Because its draw prevention ability is entirely preventative, once your opponent has gotten their searches off, your card's not going to do anything. And when Thunder King's at 1 and you're not reliably drawing into it, you're not going to get the benefit you need in preventing your opponent. A lot of times, searches lead to bigger monsters that are stronger than 1900, and all of a sudden Thunder King loses its big edge. It's not this big monster that stonewalls your opponent and prevents them from getting their strategy going. It just becomes a 1900 attack monster that has to face an even bigger field. Konami fixes that in many ways with a bunch of different cards. For example, things like Fossil Dinopacacephalo or Jowgen the Spiritualist have built-in abilities. In addition to their preventative, your opponent and yourself cannot special summon effect, they have an additional line of text that lets you get rid of monsters that are already on the board, threats that have already been established by your opponent, and that helps you go and play them after the fact. It gets around the one turn too late syndrome that you often see with cards like Effect Failure or Max C. You don't have to worry about drawing a card too late if you're able to use it even after your opponent has gone off. Another good example of a card like that would be Denko Sekka. This card, although it looks very, very preventative in how it works, it does say that as soon as it hits the board, your opponent is not able to play any back row. And that works even with things that have already been set on the board if your opponent cannot respond directly to negate the summon of Denko Sekka with a card like Solemn Warning. And that gives you a lot of power because it combines this preventative aspect of, oh, you stop your opponent from playing all these back row, with the way of functioning that it works immediately and protects itself. It immediately is live even if your opponent has already set up for their defensive pushes, or their defensive walls. So these are, of course, all three different types of stun cards, but you can see how they are different based on the timing that allows them to be played most effectively. And now the final concept I want to discuss today is that not any one of these is superior to every other in any given situation. It all depends on the metagame, and it also depends on the matchups that happen within those metagames. Think, for example, you have a Stardust Dragon. Now this thing is extremely good to stop your opponent's destruction effects that might get rid of the dragon, but what if you also like playing it against metal foes? You want to stop your opponent from using their destruction effects, so let's say you want to go Stardust Dragon. Okay, great, you stop metal foes with that. But if you're playing against decks like Blue Eyes all the time, the sheer attack cap that this vanilla has, even with no ability, is able to run over your Stardust Dragon, and that defensive protection isn't going to help you. Sure, you can go and stop removal tricks your opponent may have, but it's not strong enough to deal with the bigger body. Blue Eyes is just going to run right over that Stardust Dragon, and all of a sudden, your tough to destroy by card effect doesn't help you all that much. But what if you're playing Blue Eyes against a deck like Burning Abyss? Now all of a sudden, Dante's not strong enough to get over the Blue Eyes even with milling 3 cards. But because it has that recursive ability, your opponent's not going to want to just kill Dante outright by destroying it in battle. They'll want to use one of their effects to banish it or bounce it back to the hand or deck instead. If they don't deal with it, however, that Dante is able to continuously mill cards and generate the Burning Abyss player advantage, and so it becomes a really time-sensitive thing that the Blue Eyes player definitely wants to get rid of. So you can see how, in one situation, the high attack score was enough to win that matchup pretty much. That had the significant advantage against most of what the other strategy was doing to the point that it was able to win. But in this case, having a solid defense, or I guess a deterrent ability of sorts, is enough to stop just sheer attack power, and now there's a big stalemate where one side's getting advantage where the other is not. So again, these aren't all the examples that you will face in the dueling environments that you play in, but hopefully at least starts to illustrate for you different ways that these types of strategies can interact, and you can start picking and choosing what types of pressure cards, what types of threats do I want to play to maximize efficiency where I'm working. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. Be sure to let me know down in the comments what you think, any other ideas you think might enhance the discussion on this topic, and if you have any suggestions on future episodes, then feel free to leave those as well. Next week, we'll be back to discuss threat escalation, the concept of how should you order how you play your threats against different strategies so that you actually get the most out of your power cards. So thanks guys, this is JDGaming, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.